It's a great pleasure for me to be with you today, even virtually. I would have preferred to go to Birmingham, but this was not possible. So when Ruth invited me to this conference, I spontaneously proposed the topic of the Hexaemeron because I find these texts interesting and more entertaining than many Byzantine texts, particularly in the realm of religious literature, without wanting to insult theological literature in general. So I started only recently doing original research on the topic, but I have designed and taught over consecutive years a course entitled Stories about Bears and Other Animals, alluding to a modern Greek proverbial expression, Histories Iarkoudes. When I told Margaret Mullett about this, this course and about my project to do more serious research on the topic, she encouraged me very much to do so. So this is the first result, so to say. In my talk, I shall present primarily 3 texts belonging to very different genres, but having in common the topic of the Hexaemeron and a particular interest in animals. So I'll switch now to PowerPoint presentation. Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yep, that's perfect. Thank you, Martin.
Great. So I'm going to use a lot of text here, and I present the Greek original, Byzantine Greek original, with the keywords will be highlighted, and I will comment on these texts, or I will translate them. So yeah, for your entertainment, my words will be accompanied by depictions of animals, as you can see, belonging to Marcianus Graecus 402, a partly illustrated codex containing Michael Klika's Chronicle, the 3rd text I'm going to speak on. When we use the term Hexaemeron literature, we generally mean texts commenting on the account of Genesis, where the creation of the world in 6 days by God is narrated. 6 days, imeras, therefore Hexaemeron. According to this account, animals were created on the 5th and the 6th day. Okay. There's the next. This is the 5th day. I'll read the English translation to you. And God said, let the waters bring forth reptiles having life and winged creatures flying above the earth in the firmament of heaven. And it was so. And God made great whales and every living reptile which the waters brought forth according to their kinds, and every creature that flies with wings according to its kind. And God saw that they were good. The 6th day. And God said, let the earth bring forth the living creature according to its kind, quadrupeds and reptiles and wild beasts of the earth according to their kind. And it was so. And God made the wild beasts of the earth according to their kind, and cattle according to their kind, and all the reptiles of the earth according to their kind. And God saw they were all good. Although the texts discussed in my paper vary in their dependence on the Septuagint, they have in common the reference to the act of creation and treat animals as part of creation, according to the categories mentioned in Genesis. So here you see on this slide the main categories, herpeta, crawling animals or reptiles, enidra, zoa, nycta, water animals or swimming animals, petina, ptina, flying animals, and Chercea, tetrapoda, ctini, thieria, land animals, quadrupeds, cattle, wild beast. So note that in among these categories, there's no specific category for fish. They go together with the reptiles. Like many other parts of scripture, the Hexaemeron episode of Genesis constitutes the object of exegetical literature. Our first case study belongs to this category of texts. Basil of Caesareia treated the Hexaemeron in 9, perhaps 11 homilies, closely connected with one another. These homilies were delivered on the morning and the evening of subsequent days during Lent, perhaps of the years 378. Scholars agree that it is likely that these texts are the product of Basil's mature years. These highly rhetorical texts are among the most famous and successful products of Basil's writings. So the three homilies that concern us are homilies 7, 8, and 9. Each of these homilies has a subtitle, peri erpeton, about reptiles, periptinon and enidron, about birds and water animals, and the third is about land animals, peri Chercea. In each of these homilies, Basil's starting point are the short lines of Genesis. One of Basil's aim is to demonstrate the richness and immense diversity of creation. There are so many different species, he says. Therefore, he fleshes out the laconic references in Genesis, enumerating different kinds of animals, species. So for water animals, these categories and the examples he brings. So he says, of fish. Of one kind are those which are called testaceans, such as mussels, scallops, sea snails, conchs, and numberless varieties of bivalves. Again, another kind besides these are the fish named crustaceans, crayfish, crabs, and all similar to them. Still another kind are the so-called soft fish, whose flesh is tender and loose, polyps, cuttlefish, and those like them. And among these, again, there are innumerable varieties. In fact, there are weavers and lampreys and reels. Another class is that of ovipara, and in the sharks and the dogfish. And in general, the cartilaginous fish are vivipara. And of the cetaceans, the majority are vivipara, as dolphins and seals. He does the same for flying animals. Basil says, there are also numberless varieties of species among the birds. And if one will go through these varieties in the same manner as we applied ourselves in part to the examination of the fish, we will find one name for the winged creatures, but numberless variations among them in size and form and color. Also, an indescribably great difference among them in regard to their lives, their actions, and their customs. Some they call Schizoptera, as the eagles, others Vermoptera, as the bats, others Ptilota, as the wasps, and others Coleoptera. As you can easily understand, these are Aristotelian terms, but this is not an attempt to put order into the diversity according to Aristotelian categories, but Basil's aim is to emphasize the complexity and richness. Aristotelian terms are used, but inconsistently and not in accordance with Aristotle's doctrine. So Basil's exposition of the overwhelming amount of inexplicable facts triggers marvel and wonder, and consequently entertainment through amazement. Moreover, these innumerable different species are wondrous, each in his own way. And with rhetorical questions, Basil points to God as the hidden but ultimate cause of the animal's behavior. So here you see some examples about the wonderment and marvel these creatures provoke. Among various interesting informations about things, about animals, sorry, Basil states that although animals lack logos, which is reason, they are alloga, but here meaning without speech, they are capable of expressing their feelings in other ways. They do not need speech. They have their voice or gestures. And various animals are famous for their strong emotions. For instance, the camel for its rancour. Another example would be the partridge for its jealousy. The various information given is connected with moral exhortation. Most of Basil's homilies have a moralizing tone. And for instance, on the crab, he says, "Since you have already perceived much wickedness and plotting in weak animals, I want you to avoid imitating the evildoers. The crab longs for the flesh of the oyster, but because of the shell of the oyster, it is a prey hard for him to conquer. Nature has fastened the tender flesh in an unbroken enclosure. Therefore, the oyster is called shirt-hide. Since the two enveloping shells fitted exactly to each other and closed the oyster, the claws of the crab are necessarily of no avail. What does he do then? When he sees it pleasantly warming itself in spots sheltered from the wind and opening its valves to the rays of the sun, then, stealthily inserting a small pebble, he prevents it from closing and is found to gain, through inventiveness, what he fell short of by strength. This is the wickedness of the creatures endowed with neither reason nor voice. Now I want you, although emulating the crab's acquisitiveness and their inventiveness, to abstain from injury to your neighbors." Another such example is the viper and the sea lamprey. On the manuscript, you see both serpents. Basil says, "Husbands, love your wives, even though external to each other, you came together into the union of marriage. May the bond of nature, may the yoke imposed by the blessing make us one those who were divided. Make us one those who were divided. A viper, the cruelest of reptiles, comes from marriage with the sea lamprey, and having announced its presence by hissing, summons it forth from the depth of the nuptial embrace, and the lamprey hearkens and is united with the venomous animal. What do my words mean? That even if the husband is rough, even if he is fierce in his manners, the wife must endure and for no cause whatsoever permit herself to break the union. Basil also shows the God's care for animals and concludes that since he cares so much for a tiny animal like the swallow, he will also care for man whom he created in his own resemblance. Basil also says that animals have various impressive abilities. Among others, they have the ability to heal themselves. I quote again, "Frequently a bear, when suffering with very deep wounds, heals himself by packing the wounds through all sorts of devices with that mullein, which has astringent properties. You might also see a fox healing himself with the sap of the pine. A tortoise, having taken his fill of the flesh of vipers, escapes injury from the venom through the antidote of marjoram, and a serpent heals an injury in his eyes by feeding on fennel." The reason for all this, according to Basil, is that there is a certain law of nature underlying all these marvelous behavior. And he mentions the nomos dysphisios in various instances, as you can see. And he also says that animals are adidacta. They have not been instructed, but nevertheless know what to do. And thus very often behave in a more moral and more logical way than the human being, who again should hear the adidactos physis in himself, within himself. So the second text I'm going to speak about is the Hexaemeron poem by George of, no, I forgot something, sorry, excuse me. Yeah. For the multifarious information Basil provides, he relies on ancient sources, in particular on Aristotle and Aelian, as well as on paradoxographical writings, since he focuses on the wondrous. In a few instances, personal observation may also be in play, but these are a few unclear cases. Although Basil relies on the findings of scientists, such as Aristotle, he repeatedly expresses contempt for pure science that does not aim at the glorification of God. Through moral instruction, zoological knowledge is provided as well, but rather as a byproduct. However, the didactic aspect is clearly more important. Basil's text on the Hexaemeron became highly influential, and knowledge about animals were transmitted through it. Basil was recognized as an authority on this area of knowledge, I wouldn't say science, although it was not so much his aim to instruct as to give moral lessons, and at the same time entertain an audience that was prone to amuse themselves otherwise, playing dice games or going to taverns. As with other homilies of Basil, the original setting and its implications for the content were ignored in the aftermath. So now, my second example, George of Pisides and his Hexaemeron poem. This poem consists of 100 and 910 12-syllable verses. About 700 of these verses are loosely connected to animals. 400 are more closely connected to the Hexaemeron. Pisides' treatment of the Hexaemeron in verses draws extensively on Basil's homilies, but uses also other texts, in particular the Physiologus. So the title is Stichi istin Hexaemeron ke isto os emeralynthita erga su Kyrie. Verses on the Hexaemeron and on how great are your works, Lord, which is a verse from Psalm 91. Pisides refers to the act of creation as kosmorgia and not as the Hexaemeron, which is a word rather rare. Pisides' declared aim is the glorification of God's deeds, and hence also the subtitle referring to the psalm. Concerning his method of presentation, Pisides systematically uses a rhetorical device already employed by Basil. Almost all of the separate sections on specific animals start with a rhetorical question, such as, from where does this and this animal know what to do? Or who taught this animal to do such and such a thing? The answer always being God's creative power. So here it starts bios, normos, we have again the law. So in this passage, which is about the silkworm, Pisides says, which law tells the silkworm how to weave his threads? And he compares the survival of the silkworm within his cocoon with Jesus' resurrection. This is also the case in the second example, the swallow. Again, the poet asks, from where does the swallow regain vision after 3 days of blindness, after treating her eyes with a herb not inappropriately called chelidonion? And again, the comparison with the anastasis, that nature already has prepared examples for this miracle. Pisides' poem is not a commentary or exegetical text on Genesis, as in Basil's case. Pisides does not refer to the Septuagint texts directly. As I've said, only 400 verses are dedicated to animals and their behavior and characteristics as they form part of the created world that points to the creator who, however, remains invisible and cannot be known directly. Animals are again mentioned in the following section of the poem that deals with the usefulness of the created beings and things. The obvious fact that animals serve as nutrition is not mentioned. Instead, animals are presented as providing various medical treatments. In this part, Pisides relies on medical authors such as Galen, Estas Glikas, by the way. So, Michael Glikas, who wrote under Manuel Comnenus, the middle of the 12th century. 120 pages of his Biblos Chroniki are on creation. Pages 66 to 120 are about animals, mostly consisting of verbatim quotations from older texts, primarily from Basil's Homilies, but also Aelian, Aristotle, John Chrysostom, Anastasius Sinaitis, Nicandros, Galen, and Nemesios. According to the established rules of the genre chronicle, Glikas' chronicle treats history from the very beginning of the world. Accordingly, he refers to creation as an event in history. Chronicles have the bad reputation of slavishly repeating their predecessors, yet most works belonging to this category have also very specific traits that clearly distinguish them from other chronicles. In Glikas' case, this lies, among other things, in the extensive space given to the topic of the Hexaemeron. Indeed, it is in this specific trait that sets Biblos Chronike apart from other chronicles. So, Glikas treats animals in groups according to a common topic, as in this case, memory. Animals with memory, like the camel or the elephant, who is still known today as having a very strong memory. Glikas manifests a pseudoscientific approach. He gives answers to imagined questions. If you are interested, you should know that and that. Or exhorts to knowledge. You should know that. He occasionally searches the cause of phenomena. etia. Frequently, he gathers information concerning a specific animal from various authors, collecting all available knowledge. He juxtaposes and compares differing information given by different authors, rejecting, of course, pagans, but assuming a more neutral position when Christian authors are concerned. The manner of presentation in Glikas' chronicle is similar to the treatment of information in his other major work, The Questions and Answers. In this collection of letters, Glikas answers questions that had been submitted to him and concern various areas of general knowledge, mostly religious topics. He seemed to have enjoyed a particular reputation for this kind of activity. So another example, the juxtaposition of information about the Chameleon by Elian and Aristotle. Among the last animals discussed by Glikas, we find the unicorn, a mythical beast that can only be tamed by a virgin, allegorically interpreted as the Virgin Mary, the starting point of the development of the medieval obsession with unicorns in the West. Conclusions. The authors mentioned in this talk only rarely refer explicitly to their specific environment. Animals are almost exclusively treated as examples of divine creation, illustrating God's greatness and ingenuity. The authors rely on old tradition, only occasionally updating their material. Their starting point is not so much the observation and explication of nature as the praise of God, whose almighty power is reflected in nature. Nevertheless, on a secondary level, knowledge about animals was, of course, transmitted through these texts, since the information contained in them was originally based on the observation of nature. It is noteworthy that the information provided by our texts is representative of what a fairly well-educated Byzantine knew about animals, but it does not constitute elitist knowledge of the few. In his homilies, Basil addresses the ordinary people of his hometown. Glikas provides a course in useful general knowledge. When we compare the ways in which animals are treated as part of creation in these literary sources, we observe that there is a movement from moralizing appeal to man to praise of God, and finally completing our useful knowledge. The animals in these texts form a peculiar mixture of familiar domestic animals, wild animals found in close proximity to human settlements, and more exotic creatures, sometimes entirely fictional. The selection seems to be dictated by older written sources. None of the three authors adds personal experience, which is odd. Nevertheless, these texts provided sufficient inspiration to inspire the artist who illustrated the Marcanus Graecus 402 and made my talk more lively. Thank you very much.